I stood in the empty driveway, clutching a handwritten note and a credit card statement showing the final payment on his $103,457 student loan debt. The debt I had sacrificed everything to help pay off. The debt that was finally gone after 7 years of careful budgeting, overtime shifts, and postponed dreams. What my husband Mason didn't realize when he packed his bags and disappeared that morning was that his seemingly empty bank account wasn't empty at all. Let me tell you how I turned his betrayal into the financial liberation he never saw coming. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The rain drummed steadily against the kitchen window as I sat at our oak dining table, the one we'd found at a thrift store when we first moved in together. Scattered across the surface were bills, bank statements, and the final notice from Midwest Student Loan Services stamped "Paid in Full" in bold red letters. 7 years of financial sacrifice finally complete. 7 years of my life devoted to digging us, him, out of debt. I remember the day Mason told me about his student loans. We'd been dating for 8 months, and I was already deeply in love with his ambitious spirit and creative mind. We sat in a corner booth of Rosie's Diner, our regular Saturday morning spot. Mason fidgeted with his coffee mug, eyes downcast. "I need to tell you something, Ellie," he said, his voice uncharacteristically serious. "Before things get more serious between us." My stomach had tightened, preparing for some terrible confession. An ex-girlfriend, a criminal record, a secret family. "I'm $103,457 in debt from med school," he blurted out. "I dropped out in my 3rd year to pursue my app development dream, but the loans, they didn't disappear." I remember exhaling with relief. Just money, not a deal breaker. Not when I was already planning our future together. "We'll figure it out," I told him, reaching across the table to take his hand. Together. Together. That word carried so much weight, so much promise back then. Mason proposed 6 months later, a simple gesture with a simple band. All he could afford, he'd said apologetically. I wore that thin silver ring like it was made of diamonds, proud of what it represented. A partnership, a shared burden, a future built from struggle. The plan we created in those early days was straightforward. Mason would focus on building his app development company, chasing the big break that would launch us into financial freedom. I would handle our day-to-day expenses with my accounting job at Wilson & Bradley Financial Services, plus pick up freelance bookkeeping work on evenings and weekends. Every spare dollar would go toward his student loans. "It's an investment in our future," Mason would say, his eyes bright with conviction. "Once Rapid Build takes off, we'll be set for life. You won't have to work those extra hours anymore. We'll take that trip to Greece you've always dreamed about." Greece. I'd pinned photos of Santorini's whitewashed buildings and azure waters to our refrigerator, a daily reminder of the reward waiting on the other side of our struggle. The first year was the hardest but also the most hopeful. Our 1-bedroom apartment in Westside Park was small but cozy. Date nights became home-cooked meals by candlelight. Movie tickets were replaced by Netflix on our secondhand couch, and designer coffee was traded for the programmable coffee maker I'd received as a housewarming gift from my parents. I took on more clients for my bookkeeping business, working late into the night after my regular 9-to-5 job. Mason converted our small dining area into a makeshift office, where he hunched over his computer, coding until dawn. We were tired but unified by purpose, stealing kisses as we passed each other in our small kitchen, leaving encouraging notes in lunch bags and on bathroom mirrors. "You're amazing," Mason would whisper, pulling me close after I'd crawl into bed at midnight. "I don't deserve you." But deserving had nothing to do with it. Love isn't about tallying debts and credits. At least, that's what I believed then. By the 2nd year, we had settled into a rhythm. Every month, I'd sit at our table with my spreadsheets, calculating how much extra we could put toward the loans. Mason would hover nearby, watching the numbers shrink incrementally. We celebrated each $1,000 milestone with a bottle of cheap champagne, toasting to one step closer to freedom. That was also the year Mason landed his first significant client, Reynolds Tech Solutions, a mid-sized company needing a custom inventory management system. The contract wasn't huge, but it was steady income for 6 months. We moved the debt payoff projections up by almost a year. "See?" Mason said, spinning me around our living room after signing the contract. "It's happening, Ellie, just like I promised." I believed him. I always believed him. Year 3 brought both setbacks and steps forward. Reynolds Tech recommended Mason to other businesses, and his client list grew steadily. I was promoted to senior accountant at Wilson & Bradley, which meant a modest raise, but longer hours. The loan balance continued to decrease, but slower than we'd hoped as inflation ate into our buying power, and the interest compounded relentlessly. It was also the year we had our first serious argument about the debt. I'd discovered Mason had purchased a new high-end laptop without discussing it with me first, a $3,200 expense we hadn't budgeted for. "I needed it for work, Ellie," he argued, gesturing to the sleek machine on his desk. "My old one couldn't handle the new development environments. This is an investment in our business." Our business. He'd never called it that before, and something about the phrase made me pause. "I thought we agreed to discuss any purchase over $500, I said, fighting to keep my voice level. "That money could have gone toward the loans. And then I'd be stuck with outdated equipment that makes me less competitive," he countered. "Sometimes you have to spend money to make money." I let it go eventually. He was right about needing proper tools for his work, and the laptop would pay for itself over time. But that night marked a subtle shift in our dynamic, the first time I questioned if our priorities were still aligned. By year 4, Mason's business had expanded enough that he rented a small office space downtown. He hired 2 part-time developers to help with the growing workload. On paper, Rapid Build Technologies was becoming a success story, but a larger portion of the company's profits was being reinvested rather than directed toward the loans. "It's temporary," Mason assured me when I raised concerns. "We're in a growth phase. Once we scale up a bit more, we'll have much more to put toward the debt." I trusted his business acumen and continued my side of the bargain, working my regular job, maintaining my freelance clients, managing our household budget with meticulous precision. My friends had stopped inviting me to dinners and weekend trips, knowing my standard response: "I can't afford it right now." Lauren, my closest friend since college, confronted me over coffee one rare Saturday when I'd allowed myself a brief social outing. "When was the last time you bought something just for you?" she demanded, eyeing my faded sweater and scuffed boots. "You're working yourself to exhaustion paying off his debt while he's expanding his business." "It's not like that," I defended, even as a small voice whispered that maybe it was exactly like that. "We're partners. His success is my success." Lauren's expression softened with concern. "Just make sure the partnership goes both ways, Ellie." Her words lingered in my mind as I drove home, but I pushed them aside. Mason and I were in this together. We had a plan. We were making progress. Year 5 brought a significant milestone. Mason's company landed a contract with Vertex Industries, a national corporation needing a complete overhaul of their customer management system. The project would take 18 months and pay enough that Mason could hire 2 full-time developers and an office manager. "This is it, Ellie," he said, eyes shining as he showed me the signed contract. "This is the break we've been waiting for." We celebrated at an actual restaurant that night, our first non-home dinner in years. Mason ordered champagne, real champagne, not the grocery store brand we usually toasted with. Under the warm restaurant lights, watching his animated expressions as he detailed his plans for the project, I felt a surge of pride. All our sacrifices were finally bearing fruit. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," Mason said, raising his glass. You're the foundation that made everything possible. I smiled, clinking my glass against his, ignoring the small voice that wondered when some of that success would translate to less pressure on my shoulders. The Vertex contract changed our lives in unexpected ways. Mason was suddenly busy beyond belief, often staying at his office until midnight, sometimes sleeping on the couch there rather than coming home. I saw him less and less, our lives running on parallel tracks rather than intertwined paths. When I suggested using some of the new income to accelerate loan payments, Mason hesitated. "We need to reinvest in the company while we have momentum," he explained. "This contract could lead to bigger ones if we deliver excellence." So I continued working both jobs, continued pinching pennies, and continued putting my dreams on hold. The loan balance decreased steadily, if slower than I'd hoped. 5 more years, I calculated. 5 more years until freedom. But something had changed between us. The shared struggle that had once united us now seemed to affect us differently. My sacrifices continued unabated, while Mason began allowing himself small luxuries: designer clothes for client meetings, networking dinners at upscale restaurants, a membership at a co-working space with premium amenities. It's part of building. The business image, he justified when I questioned these expenses. Clients expect a certain presentation. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I began to notice other changes too. Mason started attending industry conferences without mentioning them until his bags were packed. His phone would buzz constantly during our rare evenings together, and he'd step away to take calls in private. When he did talk about work, unfamiliar names peppered his stories, especially one name, Amber, his new project manager. "You should meet her sometime," he said casually one night over takeout containers at our rarely used dining table. "She's brilliant at client relations, completely transformed how we handle project deliverables." I nodded, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. I'd like that. But the invitation never materialized. Instead, Mason's absences grew longer, his explanations vaguer. When I'd call his office after hours, the calls would go to voicemail. Texts would be answered hours later with brief responses. Despite the growing distance between us, I remained focused on our goal. The loan balance had finally dropped below $30,000. The end was in sight. Just a little longer, I told myself. Just a little more sacrifice. By year 6, Rapid Build Technologies had 10 employees and had moved to a larger office in the downtown business district. Mason rarely discussed the specifics of company finances with me anymore, deflecting my questions, with vague assurances that everything was on track. Our conversations about the loans became shorter, less detailed, though I still made the payments from our joint account each month. I began to notice other changes too. Mason started attending industry conferences without mentioning them until his bags were packed. His phone would buzz constantly during our rare evenings together, and he'd step away to take calls in private. When he did talk about work, unfamiliar names peppered his stories, especially one name, Amber, his new project manager. "You should meet her sometime," he said casually one night over takeout containers at our rarely used dining table. "She's brilliant at client relations, completely transformed how we handle project deliverables." I nodded, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. I'd like that. But the invitation never materialized. Instead, Mason's absences grew longer, his explanations vaguer. When I'd call his office after hours, the calls would go to voicemail. Texts would be answered hours later with brief responses. Despite the growing distance between us, I remained focused on our goal. The loan balance had finally dropped below $30,000. The end was in sight. Just a little longer, I told myself. Just a little more sacrifice. 7 years into our marriage, almost to the day we'd made our first loan payment together, I received a promotion at Wilson & Bradley, senior financial analyst with a substantial raise. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine life after the debt. Maybe cutting back on my freelance work, maybe finally planning that trip to Greece. I called Mason immediately with the news. "That's great, Ellie," he said, his voice distracted, office noise loud in the background. "Listen, I'm in a meeting. We'll celebrate tonight, okay?" But he didn't come home that night. A text at 11 p.m. explained he was working late on a proposal. Deadline. I fell asleep on the couch waiting, the champagne I'd bought unopened in the refrigerator. The next morning, I made a decision. With my raise and some money I'd been setting aside from my freelance work, my emergency fund that even Mason didn't know about, I could make a final lump sum payment on his student loans. We could be free of the debt a year earlier than projected. I transferred the money without telling him, wanting it to be a surprise. The confirmation email arrived minutes later. Loan payoff successful. Balance 0.00. 7 years of sacrifice. 7 years of delayed dreams. 7 years of putting his needs before mine. Finally complete. I prepared a special dinner that evening, set the table with our rarely used wedding china, and waited. At 8 p.m., I texted Mason. No response. At 10 p.m., I called his office. No answer. At midnight, I gave up and put the cold food away. The loan payoff confirmation printed and placed in an envelope beside his plate. He didn't come home that night either. The next morning, I woke to the sound of the front door closing. Rushing. Downstairs in my robe, I found Mason in the hallway, suitcase in hand, startled by my appearance. "Ellie," he said, his voice strange and formal. "I didn't expect you to be up yet. Where have you been?" I asked, confusion turning to dread as I noticed the suitcase, the careful way he was holding himself apart from me. "I need to talk to you," he said, setting down the suitcase. "I've been trying to find the right time, the right way." The world seemed to slow down as he spoke. Words like "grown apart" and "different paths" and "never meant to hurt you" flowed around me like water, not quite penetrating the sudden ringing in my ears. "It's Amber, isn't it?" I finally interrupted, pieces clicking into horrible places. His silence was answer enough. "How long?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. 6 months, he admitted, having the grace to look ashamed. "It just happened, Ellie. We were working late on the Vertex project and things just evolved. Evolved. Like his betrayal was some kind of natural progression, an inevitable outcome. I was going to tell you," he continued, "but with the financial pressure, the loans, I didn't want to add to your stress." I laughed then, a sharp, unfamiliar sound. "The loans are paid off, Mason, as of yesterday." His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "What? How?" I pointed to the envelope on the side table. "My promotion, my savings, my sacrifice. One final payment to clear your debt." He opened the envelope with shaking hands, staring at the confirmation as though it might transform into something else before his eyes. "Ellie, I don't know what to say. This is incredible. Congratulations," I said flatly. "You're debt-free, free to start your new life without financial burden." He flinched at my tone, then reached for me. I stepped back, wrapping my robe tighter around myself. "Don't," I warned. "Just don't." "I never meant for this to happen," he said, hand dropping to his side. "You have to believe that." But I didn't have to believe anything anymore. 7 years of trusting his promises, his plans, his vision for our future. That was over now. "You should go," I said, suddenly exhausted beyond words. "Your new life is waiting." He hesitated, conflict clear on his face, perhaps calculating what he owed me, what parting words could possibly suffice for years of support abandoned the moment his burden was lifted. "I'll have my lawyer contact you about the house, the accounts," he finally said, reaching for his suitcase again. "For what it's worth, I really am sorry." I watched him walk out the door, down the pathway to the curb where a sleek black car waited, a car I'd never seen before. As he loaded his suitcase into the trunk, I caught a glimpse of the driver, a woman with long auburn hair, sunglasses hiding her expression. The door closed behind him with a final sounding click, and I stood alone in our entryway, the paid-off loan statement still on the side table, the only concrete result of 7 years of partnership. I moved through the house like a ghost that morning, touching furniture we'd chosen together, looking at photos from happier times, trying to understand how I'd missed the signs of his growing detachment. In our home office, his desk was cleared of personal items. Clearly, he'd been removing things gradually, preparing for this exit. Opening his desk drawer out of habit, I found a single remaining item, a small black ledger I'd never seen before. Inside were handwritten notes tracking deposits to an account number I didn't recognize. Regular transfers, growing larger over the past 3 years, totaling over $300,000. I frowned, pulling my laptop closer. None of this matched the company. Financials Mason had occasionally shared with me. This wasn't a business account I was familiar with. It wasn't our joint savings, which contained a modest emergency fund and nothing more. With growing suspicion, I logged into our online banking portal. Our joint checking account, the one I'd used to make the final loan payment just yesterday, was nearly empty. The joint savings account showed a balance of $4,300, far less than the $15,000 I'd last seen there. My heart pounding, I checked my personal accounts, the ones connected to my freelance work, still intact. Then I looked at the transaction history for our joint accounts, scrolling through recent activity. There it was. A series of transfers over the past month, moving money from our joint savings to an external account. Mason had been systematically emptying our shared funds, preparing for his departure even as I was preparing to clear his debt. But the black ledger suggested something more, something that made my accountant's mind race with possibilities and suspicions. $300,000, hidden away somewhere I hadn't known to look. I sat back in the office chair. Loan. Payment confirmation in one hand, mysterious ledger in the other. The initial shock and pain of Mason's betrayal began to crystallize into something harder, more focused. He thought he'd walked away clean, debt-free, and consequence-free. What he didn't realize was that he'd left behind clues to a much bigger deception, one that his financially savvy wife was uniquely qualified to unravel. Standing in the empty driveway where his car had been parked just hours before, I made myself a promise. This wasn't the end of our story. It was merely the beginning of a very different one where the surprise waiting in his bank account would change everything. I gave myself exactly 1 day to grieve, 24 hours to cycle through shock, anger, and heartbreak before transforming those emotions into something more productive. The morning after Mason left, I sat at our kitchen table surrounded by financial documents, the mysterious black ledger open beside my laptop. As a senior, financial analyst who specialized in forensic accounting, I'd spent my career following money trails for others. It was time to use those skills for myself. The ledger contained 3 years of entries, dates, amounts, and a cryptic notation system that wasn't immediately decipherable. But one thing was clear. This wasn't standard business accounting. The pattern of deposits didn't match the growth trajectory Mason had described for rapid build technologies. These were systematic transfers to an account I had never seen referenced in our joint finances. I called in sick to work, my first unscheduled absence in 5 years, and drove downtown to Rapid Build's office. The modern glass building housed several tech startups, with Mason's company occupying the entire 3rd floor. I'd only visited a handful of times, usually for holiday parties or to drop off something Mason had forgotten at home. The receptionist, a young woman I didn't recognize, smiled uncertainly when I introduced myself. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Parker, but Mason isn't in today." "I know," I replied, maintaining a calm I didn't feel. "I just need to pick up some personal documents from his office." Her hesitation was visible. "He usually tells me when someone will be coming by." "It was a last-minute thing," I explained, pulling out my driver's license. "I'm his wife. See? Same address." This seemed to reassure her slightly, but she reached for her phone. "Let me just check with Amber first. She's acting as interim CEO. While Mason's away." Interim CEO. The words hit like a physical blow. He'd already arranged for his absence, already positioned his mistress to run the company he'd built with my financial support. "Actually," I said quickly, "Amber asked me to meet her here. We have some financial matters to discuss." The lie came, easily, born of desperation and righteous anger. The receptionist looked confused but put down the phone. "Oh, I didn't realize. She's in a meeting, but it should be ending soon. You can wait in Mason's office if you'd like." "Perfect." I was escorted down a hallway lined with motivational posters and framed press clippings about Rapid Build's innovative solutions. Mason's corner office was exactly as I'd expected, sleek and modern with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. What I hadn't expected was the framed photo on his desk. Mason and a striking woman with auburn hair, Amber presumably, accepting some kind of industry award. My face was nowhere to be seen in his professional space. The receptionist hesitated. At the door. "Can I get you anything while you wait? Coffee?" "No, thank you," I replied with a practiced smile. "I know my way around." The moment she left, I began a methodical search of Mason's office. His computer was password protected, but I knew his pattern. Our anniversary date followed by his mother's maiden name. 7 years of marriage had its advantages. I wasn't sure what I was looking for until I found it. A folder labeled Cayman Holdings, tucked into the back of his filing cabinet. Inside were incorporation documents for an offshore company established 3 years ago, shortly after Rapid Build landed the Reynolds Tech contract. The sole shareholders listed were Mason Parker and Amber Reeves. My hands trembled as I photographed each page with my phone. This wasn't just a personal betrayal. This was something potentially illegal. A separate business entity that seemed designed to divert funds from Rapid Build, the company whose growth I had subsidized with years of financial sacrifice. I heard voices approaching in the hallway and quickly returned the folder to its hiding place, positioning myself in a visitor's chair with my phone in hand as if checking emails. The door opened to reveal the woman from the photograph, tall, confident, with expertly highlighted auburn hair and a tailored blazer that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. "Mrs. Parker?" she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "This is unexpected." "Amber," I replied, rising to my feet. "I thought it was time we met." Her composure faltered slightly before she regained control. "Mason mentioned you might be stopping by to collect some personal items. I can have someone help you box things up." "Actually," I said, keeping my voice level, "I'm more interested in some financial clarifications, given that my personal funds were used to support Rapid Build during its development phase." Amber's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Any investment you made was between you and Mason. The company's finances are confidential." "Confidential," I repeated. "Like Cayman Holdings?" The flash of alarm in her eyes confirmed what I needed to know. She was fully aware of the offshore account. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," she recovered smoothly. "But if you have concerns about your personal investment in Rapid Build, you should address them with Mason. Or your lawyer." "I intend to," I assured her, gathering my purse. "In fact, I'll be addressing quite a few concerns very thoroughly." As I moved toward the door, she called after me. "Ellie, may I call you Ellie? I know this situation is difficult, but business is business. Try not to confuse personal matters with professional ones." I turned back to face her, my accountant's mask firmly in place. "That's excellent advice, Amber. I suggest you follow it yourself." Mixing personal relationships with financial impropriety rarely ends well for anyone involved. The uncertainty that flickered across her face was small but satisfying as I walked out. Back in my car, I reviewed the photos I'd taken, my mind racing with implications. Cayman Holdings appeared to be a shell company, likely used to divert profits from Rapid Build, to avoid taxes, or to hide assets from someone. From me. My next stop was the office of Thomas Wilson, the founding partner at Wilson & Bradley and my longtime mentor. A specialist in financial fraud investigation, Tom had taken me under his wing when I first joined the firm as a junior accountant. If anyone could help me understand what I was dealing with, it was him. His assistant showed me in immediately despite my unscheduled visit. Tom's corner office, with its dark wood furnishings and walls lined with legal texts, couldn't have been more different from Mason's sleek modern space. "Ellie," he greeted me warmly, then paused, studying my face. "What's happened?" I placed the black ledger on his desk, along with printouts of the photos I'd taken at Rapid Build. "I need your professional opinion on something, Tom, off the record." For the next hour, I explained everything. Mason's departure, the discovery of the ledger, the offshore company, the systematic transfers that matched the timeline of Rapid Build's growth. Tom listened without interruption, occasionally making notes or examining a document more closely. "If what you're describing is accurate," he said finally, "Mason and his partner have likely been engaging in what we call profit skimming, diverting company profits before they're reported as income, possibly to avoid taxes or to hide assets." "From me," I clarified. "He's been preparing for this exit for years, hasn't he?" Tom nodded gravely. "It appears so. The timing of the offshore incorporation, 3 years ago, just as the company began showing significant profit, suggests a deliberate strategy." "Is it illegal?" "Potentially," Tom replied, choosing his words carefully. "It depends on how the funds were classified, what was reported to the IRS, and whether investor funds were involved. At minimum, it's highly questionable from a tax perspective." He leaned back in his chair, studying me. "The bigger question is, what do you want to do about it?" It was a loaded question. Did I want revenge? Justice? Financial compensation? All of the above? "I want what's rightfully mine," I said finally. 7 years of my life went into building that company, supporting Mason, paying off his debt so he could pursue his dreams. If he's been hiding profits, that should have been declared as marital assets. I want to know exactly how much and where it's being kept. Tom nodded, understanding exactly what I was asking. "We'll need to be careful. Offshore accounts are deliberately designed to be difficult to trace. And if Mason realizes you're investigating, he may move the funds or take other evasive actions." "He thinks I'm just a heartbroken wife," I replied, a new resolve hardening within me. "He has no idea what I'm capable of professionally." "That may be our advantage," Tom agreed. "But we'll need more evidence than this. Bank records, transfer confirmations, tax filings for both Rapid Build and this Cayman entity." I thought of Mason's easy-to-guess password patterns, his careless habit of reusing credentials across multiple accounts. I might be able to get some of that. Tom's expression was both concerned and impressed. "Be careful, Ellie. What you're describing could have serious legal implications, for both Mason and potentially for you if you access information improperly." "I understand the risks," I assured him, "but I also understand reward calculations. 7 years of my life, Tom. 7 years of putting his dreams ahead of mine." He studied me for a moment longer, then reached for his phone. "Let me call Rachel Davis. She's the best forensic financial investigator I know, and she's worked extensively on cases involving offshore holdings." An hour later, I sat across from Rachel in the firm's conference room, surrounded by documents and laptop screens. With her pixie haircut, multiple ear piercings, and casual attire, Rachel didn't look like my mental image of a financial investigator. But her sharp questions and rapid analysis of the information I'd provided quickly demonstrated her expertise. Based on the transfer patterns in this ledger, she explained, pointing to the mysterious black book, I'd estimate the offshore account currently holds between $300,000 and $400,000, possibly more if they've been investing the funds rather than just holding them. The figure made me dizzy. All those nights I'd worked until exhaustion, all the vacations we'd never taken, all the dreams I'd put on hold, while Mason had been systematically siphoning off profits that should have benefited us both. Can we trace it? I asked. Definitively. Link the funds to Rapid Build and to Mason? Rachel's smile was small but confident. Offshore accounts aren't as impenetrable as they used to be. International banking regulations have tightened considerably in recent years. With the right documentation and legal pressure, yes, we can trace it. What do you need from me? Access, she replied simply. To Rapid Build's financial records, tax filings, banking information, anything that might show the source of these transfers. I thought about the incorporation documents I'd photographed, Mason's predictable passwords, the desktop computer in our home office that likely contained copies of tax returns and business records. I can get you what you need, I promised. But I need to move quickly before Mason realizes what I've discovered. That evening, I returned to the empty house with renewed purpose. The pain of betrayal was still there, a dull ache beneath my ribs, but it was now overshadowed by a more powerful emotion: determination. In our home office, I booted up the desktop computer Mason had primarily used for business before establishing his company headquarters. As expected, his password pattern held true. Within minutes, I was scrolling through folders of business documents, tax filings, and financial spreadsheets. What I found confirmed my suspicions and worse. Not only had Mason been diverting company profits to the offshore account, but he'd also been using our joint funds, money I had earned through my multiple jobs, to cover Rapid Build's operational costs during lean periods. All while the company showed substantial profits that mysteriously never appeared in our joint accounts. More disturbing were emails between Mason and Amber dating back nearly 2 years, long before the 6 months of affair he'd admitted to. They discussed not only their relationship, but also their plans for the offshore account, referring to it as their exit strategy fund. I forwarded everything to Rachel, using the secure file transfer system she'd set up. By midnight, she had confirmed receipt and was already analyzing the documents. This is exactly what we needed, her message read. Initial assessment suggests approximately $427,000 in diverted funds over the past 3 years. I'm tracing the specific banking channels now. $427,000. The number seemed surreal. All those years of careful budgeting, of denying myself even small luxuries, of working until exhaustion, while Mason and his partner built a secret nest egg funded in part by my sacrifices. I slept fitfully that night, waking repeatedly to check for updates from Rachel. By morning, she had traced the funds to a specific bank in Grand Cayman and identified the account number, matching the cryptic notations in the black ledger. We have enough to approach an attorney specializing in high-asset divorce cases, she wrote. The evidence suggests clear financial misconduct and hidden marital assets. As I prepared for work that morning, maintaining normal routines was crucial to avoiding suspicion. My phone rang. Mason's name flashed on the screen, the first contact since his abrupt departure. I answered with practiced neutrality. Hello? Ellie. His voice held an unfamiliar note of concern. Amber mentioned you came by the office yesterday. Yes, I replied simply. I needed to understand some things. A pause. What things exactly? Financial things, Mason. The kind of things a wife might wonder about after her husband abandons her the day after she pays off his massive student debt. Another pause, longer this time. Ellie, I know you're upset, and you have every right to be. But I don't want this to turn ugly. I've instructed my lawyer to prepare a generous settlement offer. Generous, I repeated, the word tasting bitter. Based on what calculations exactly? Based on our marital assets, he replied, an edge creeping into his voice. The house, our savings, my stake in Rapid Build. And what about Cayman Holdings? I interrupted, savoring the sudden silence on the other end. Should that factor into your generous calculations? When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a near whisper. What do you know about that? Enough, I replied simply. Enough to know that your generous settlement offer might need significant revision. Ellie, listen to me, he began. The smooth confidence returning to his voice. Whatever you think you know. Save it for the depositions, Mason. I cut him off. My lawyer will be in touch with yours very soon. I ended the call before he could respond, my heart pounding but my resolve stronger than ever. The balance of power had just shifted dramatically, and Mason knew it. Within the hour, my phone buzzed with messages from Rachel. Unusual activity on the Cayman account this morning. Large transfer initiated. They're moving the money. Mason was panicking, exactly as Tom had warned he might, but his desperate attempt to hide the assets would only strengthen our case. I texted back, "Can we stop it?" Rachel's response was immediate. Already on it, filing emergency injunction based on evidence of potential dissipation of marital assets. By lunchtime, Tom had connected me with Catherine Winters, one of the city's most formidable divorce attorneys specializing in financial fraud cases. Her firm occupied the top floor of a downtown high-rise, the sleek offices projecting exactly the kind of confident success I needed on my side. Catherine reviewed the evidence Rachel had compiled, her expression growing increasingly interested. "This is quite the paper trail," she remarked, examining the transaction records Rachel had managed to obtain through her financial industry connections. "And the timing of the attempted fund transfer this morning, immediately after your conversation, only strengthens our position." "What's our next move?" I asked. Catherine's smile was measured but confident. "We file for divorce immediately, with an emergency motion to freeze all assets connected to both Mason personally and these business entities. We request expedited discovery focused specifically on these offshore holdings, and we depose both Mason and Ms. Reeves about their financial arrangements. And if they've already moved the money? Money leaves trails," she assured me. "Especially when moving in panic. Based on what you've shown me, your husband is clever but not particularly sophisticated in his financial maneuvers. More importantly, he severely underestimated who he was dealing with. For the first time since Mason had walked out the door, with his suitcase, I felt a flicker of something approaching satisfaction. He had discarded me the moment his debt was cleared, assuming I would meekly accept whatever settlement he deigned to offer. He had no idea that his seemingly empty bank account wasn't empty at all, and that I had both the skills and determination to follow every dollar he'd hidden away. As Catherine began drafting the initial filing, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Amber. We need to talk. Privately." I showed the message to Catherine, who arched an eyebrow. "Interesting. They're already not presenting a united front." "Should I respond?" Catherine considered this. "Yes, but not yet. Let's wait until our filings are in place. Sometimes silence is the most effective pressure." By the end of the day, Catherine's team had prepared all the necessary documents. Tomorrow morning, Mason would be served with divorce papers that included detailed references to the offshore account, the systematic fund transfers, and the attempted movement of assets that very morning. As I drove home to the empty house that had once represented our shared dreams, I felt an unfamiliar sense of power replacing the hollow ache of betrayal. Mason had spent years building his exit strategy, carefully hiding assets while I worked myself to exhaustion paying off his debt. But he had made one critical miscalculation. He had chosen to betray an accountant who specialized in following money trails, who understood financial forensics, who had spent her career uncovering exactly the kind of scheme he thought he had executed perfectly. The game was just beginning, and Mason was about to discover that his supposedly empty bank account held a surprise that would change everything. The divorce papers were served to Mason at 8:17 a.m. the following morning. I know this because Rachel had arranged for the process server to text me confirmation immediately after delivery. I was sitting in Catherine Winter's office when the message came through, a simple "documents delivered" that carried the weight of a declaration of war. "Now we wait," Catherine said, closing the folder containing copies of our filings. "Based on the evidence we've presented, the judge should rule on our motion to freeze assets within 48 hours. And if Mason tries to transfer more funds, before then?" I asked. "The attempt this morning triggered alerts at several regulatory levels," she explained. "International banking transfers over certain amounts receive additional scrutiny, especially when connected to known tax havens. The paper trail will only strengthen our case." I nodded, trying to focus on the strategic aspects rather than the emotional toll. The financial analyst in me understood the mechanics of what we were doing. The betrayed wife was still processing the collapse of a 7-year marriage. My phone buzzed again, another text from Amber. "We need to talk. It's in both our interests." Catherine glanced at the message. "She's nervous. That's good for us. Should I meet with her?" "Not alone," Catherine advised, "and not without understanding her angle first. Let's see what she wants." I typed a response. "What exactly do you want to discuss?" The reply came almost immediately. "Not over text. Meet me at Riverside Park near the boat landing, 1 p.m. today. Come alone." Catherine's eyebrow arched as she read the message. Dramatic. She's either panicking or setting up something. Either way, you shouldn't go alone. "I want to hear what she has to say," I insisted. Something in Amber's urgency suggested an opportunity I didn't want to miss. Catherine considered this. "My investigator, Marcus, can be nearby. He's discreet, but effective if there's any unpleasantness." The thought that I might need protection from physical threat hadn't occurred to me. Mason had betrayed me financially and romantically, but violence had never been part of our relationship. Still, I was stepping into unknown territory, challenging people who had already demonstrated their willingness to act unethically. "That seems reasonable," I agreed. Catherine made the arrangements while I prepared for the meeting, mentally rehearsing various scenarios. What could Amber possibly want to discuss that would benefit both of us? Was she planning to offer some kind of settlement? Or was this an attempt to intimidate me into dropping the financial investigation? Riverside Park was busy with lunchtime joggers and office workers enjoying the unusually warm spring day. I spotted Amber immediately, her auburn hair catching the sunlight as she sat on a bench overlooking the water. She wore large sunglasses and a casual outfit that still managed to look expensive. Designer jeans and a silk blouse that probably cost more than my entire outfit. A quick glance around the area revealed Catherine's investigator Marcus, a nondescript man in a windbreaker, seemingly absorbed in his phone on a bench about 30 feet away. His presence was reassuring as I approached Amber. She looked up as my shadow fell across her. "You came." Something like relief tinged her voice. "You seemed insistent," I replied, keeping my tone neutral as I sat beside her, maintaining a careful distance. "I didn't think you would bring backup," she noted, tilting her head slightly toward Marcus. "And I didn't think my husband's mistress would request a clandestine meeting in a park," I countered. "Yet here we are." She winced at the word mistress, but quickly recovered her composure. "I prefer to think of myself as Mason's partner." "Business partner or romantic partner?" I asked. "The distinction seems deliberately blurred in your arrangement." Amber removed her sunglasses, revealing eyes sharp with calculation. "Both, obviously. But that's not why I asked you here." "I'm listening." She turned slightly to face me directly. "Your divorce was filed yesterday. It's creating complications." Financial complications, you mean, I clarified. Among others. She paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. The asset freeze has put certain business operations in jeopardy. Operations run through Cayman Holdings rather than Rapid Build? I suggested it innocently. Her lips tightened. You're very well informed for someone who hasn't been involved in the company's daily operations. I'm an accountant who specializes in forensic financial analysis, I reminded her. Following money trails is literally my profession. This information seemed to surprise her, and I realized Mason had likely minimized my capabilities when discussing me with his partner. Another miscalculation on his part. Then you'll understand why I'm here, Amber continued. The freeze on those accounts is potentially damaging to projects in development, projects that represent significant future income. Projects funded with diverted profits that should have been declared as marital assets, I countered. Amber leaned forward. Here's what you may not understand, Ellie. The $427,000 you've identified, that's just the beginning. The intellectual property and development contracts held by Cayman Holdings are worth potentially 10 times that amount. The figure hit me, like a physical blow. Over $4 million in potential value, hidden away while I worked myself to exhaustion paying off Mason's student loans. Which makes the financial misconduct even more significant, I managed to reply, fighting to maintain my professional demeanor. Or, Amber suggested, it makes a potential settlement much more valuable if handled discreetly. And there it was, the reason for this meeting. They were offering to buy my silence. What exactly are you proposing? Amber glanced around before continuing in a lower voice. Mason is prepared to offer you $1 million. Cash transfer to any account you designate, within 24 hours. In exchange, you drop the financial misconduct claims and agree to a standard divorce settlement based solely on declared domestic assets. $1 million. A substantial sum, but far less than I might be entitled to if the offshore holdings were properly valued and divided as marital property. And what about Rapid Build? I asked. The company I helped build by supporting Mason financially for years? You'd retain no interest in the company, Amber stated flatly. The settlement would constitute a complete separation of all business interests. I considered her offer, or rather Mason's offer delivered through his proxy. It was substantial enough to be tempting, immediate financial security without a protracted legal battle. But it was also an admission that they had much more to hide, much more to lose. Why not have Mason propose this himself? Amber's expression tightened momentarily. Mason is not handling the situation well. He didn't expect this level of financial scrutiny. He didn't expect me to fight back, I translated. He underestimated you, she acknowledged. We both did. The admission was surprisingly satisfying, though I kept my expression neutral. I'll need time to consider the offer, I said finally. You have until tomorrow morning, Amber replied, rising from the bench and replacing her sunglasses. After that, we pursue other options. Is that a threat? Her smile was thin. It's a business reality. Assets that can't be transferred can still be devalued or eliminated entirely. Mason built Rapid Build once. He can dissolve it just as efficiently if necessary. As Amber walked away, Marcus casually moved closer, pretending to watch the boats on the river while maintaining proximity, in case she tried to return. Did you get all that? I asked when he joined me on the bench. He nodded, tapping the recording device concealed under his windbreaker. Every word. Ms. Winters will be interested in the implied threat to dissipate assets. Back at Catherine's office, we replayed the recording of my conversation with Amber. Catherine listened intently, occasionally making notes. This is extremely useful, she said when the playback concluded. Not only have they acknowledged the offshore holdings, but they've also essentially admitted the assets are worth far more than initially documented, and the thinly veiled threat to deliberately devalue company assets rather than divide them fairly judges typically take a very dim view of such tactics. "What about their offer?" I asked. $1 million is significant. It's a fraction of what you're likely entitled to, Catherine countered. And accepting it would mean surrendering any claim to future value from intellectual property you helped fund through your support. She was right, of course. The offer was designed to limit their losses, not to provide me with fair compensation for years of sacrifice. "There's something else to consider," Rachel interjected, having joined us for the debriefing. "Based on the documents we've recovered, Rapid Build is positioned for a potential acquisition by SyncTech Industries. The preliminary valuation documents suggest an offer in the range of $20 million might be forthcoming." The figure momentarily robbed me of speech. $20 million for the company I had helped build through years of financial support, the company Mason had been prepared to cut me out of entirely. "When was this valuation prepared?" I finally asked. Rachel consulted her notes. 3 months ago, around the same time, we see a significant increase in transfers to the Cayman account. They've been preparing for this acquisition while systematically hiding assets, Catherine concluded, likely planning to finalize the divorce before the acquisition becomes public knowledge. The calculated nature of the betrayal struck deeper than the initial shock of Mason's departure. This wasn't just an affair that had spiraled into abandonment. This was a methodically planned financial deception designed to deprive me of the fruits of our shared sacrifice. "Reject their offer," I said decisively, "and let's accelerate the discovery process regarding this potential acquisition." Catherine nodded approvingly. "I'll draft the rejection and file additional motions for emergency discovery specifically targeting the SyncTech negotiations." By that evening, our response was delivered to Mason's attorney. A comprehensive rejection of the settlement offer coupled with detailed questions about the potential SyncTech acquisition and demands for immediate production of all related documents. Expected an angry call from Mason, but instead received another text from Amber. "You're making a serious mistake. The offer expires at midnight." I didn't respond. Let them wonder about my next move, just as I had spent years wondering about our financial future while Mason secretly diverted funds. At 11:58 p.m., 2 minutes before their arbitrary deadline, my phone rang. Mason's name flashed on the screen. I almost declined the call, but curiosity won out. "You're turning down $1 million, he said without preamble, his voice tight with controlled anger. "That's irrational, Ellie." "Is it irrational to seek fair compensation for 7 years of financial support?" I countered. "For working multiple jobs to pay off your student loans while you built a company now valued at $20 million. His sharp intake of breath confirmed Rachel's intelligence about the SyncTech offer. "Who told you about SyncTech?" he demanded. "You did," I replied. "Just now." A charged silence filled the line. "What do you want, Ellie?" he finally asked, the anger in his voice replaced by something closer to resignation. "What's rightfully mine?" I answered simply. "My fair share of everything we built together, including the assets you've hidden offshore." "That's not how business works," he argued. "You can't claim ownership of a company you weren't directly involved in building." "But I was directly involved," I corrected him. "Every extra shift I worked to cover our living expenses while you reinvested in the company. Every client I took on to make the student loan payments that freed you to pursue your business dreams. Every sacrifice I made allowed you to build Rapid Build without the burden of personal debt." Another silence, longer this time. $2 million, he finally offered. "Final offer, contingent on immediate settlement and complete confidentiality." "Not even close," I replied, a newfound confidence strengthening my voice. "I suggest you review the discovery requests my attorney filed this afternoon. The clock is ticking on those responses, and judges tend to get irritable when parties withhold information about imminent business transactions that might affect asset valuation." "You're going to destroy everything," he said, his voice hardening. "Again. If this drags out in court, SyncTech will walk away. Nobody wants to acquire a company embroiled in a messy divorce with financial misconduct allegations. That sounds like a problem, I replied, channeling the cold calculation he had applied to our marriage. You created this situation, Mason. You hid assets, you diverted funds, you planned an exit strategy that deliberately excluded me from the fruits of our shared sacrifice. It wasn't like that, he protested, but the conviction in his voice was wavering. It was exactly like that, I countered. The ledger, the offshore accounts, the carefully timed departure the moment my final payment cleared your student loans. It all tells a very clear story, one that any judge will find compelling. The call ended abruptly, Mason apparently having no response to the truth laid so plainly before him. I slept poorly that night, anticipating the next move in this high-stakes chess game. Mason had always prided himself on being several steps ahead, on anticipating market trends and competitor moves. But he had never faced an opponent who knew him as intimately as I did, who understood his patterns and weaknesses, who had access to his financial history and business documentation. My phone buzzed at 6:17 a.m. with a text from Rachel, urgent. Multiple transfers attempted overnight from a Cayman account, all blocked by court order. Also, unusual activity at the Rapid Build server facility. Possible data deletion attempt. They were getting desperate, trying to move or destroy assets despite the court orders. Each attempt only strengthened our case, creating a documented pattern of deliberate financial misconduct that no family court judge would view favorably. I forwarded the message to Catherine, who responded immediately. Filing emergency motion. For digital forensics team to secure all company records. Court hearing scheduled for 9 a.m. By the time I arrived at the courthouse, Catherine was already conferring with the digital forensics expert she had engaged, a former FBI cybercrime specialist who now worked exclusively on high-asset divorce cases. Based on the server logs we've obtained, there appears to be a systematic attempt to alter or delete financial records, he explained, showing us activity logs on his tablet. Fortunately, the automated backup systems captured the original data, allowing us to document exactly what they're trying to conceal. The hearing was brief, but consequential. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with 20 years of experience in family court, listened to the evidence of attempted asset dissipation and data manipulation with growing concern. This court takes a very dim view of parties attempting to circumvent asset preservation orders, she stated, fixing Mason's attorney with a stern gaze. I am granting the plaintiff's motion for appointment of a forensic accounting team with full access to all business records, digital systems, and financial accounts associated with both Mr. Parker personally and his business entities. She turned to address Mason directly. Furthermore, any additional attempts to transfer, conceal, or destroy assets will result in contempt charges. Am I making myself clear, Mr. Parker? Mason nodded stiffly, avoiding eye contact with me across the courtroom. Beside him, Amber sat rigidly, her expression hidden behind large designer sunglasses despite the indoor setting. As we exited the courtroom, Catherine squeezed my arm gently. That went exactly as we hoped. With the forensic team having full access, there's nowhere left for them to hide assets or manipulate records. I nodded, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. This wasn't how I had imagined our marriage ending, in courtrooms with forensic experts and asset freezes. But Mason had chosen this path the moment he began diverting funds and planning his exit strategy. In the courthouse lobby, I found myself face to face with Amber as she separated momentarily from Mason to take a phone call. Without her sunglasses, I could see the strain in her eyes, the carefully controlled panic. This isn't personal, I told her quietly. It's just business. She recognized her own words from our park meeting thrown back at her, her mouth tightening into a thin line. You have no idea what you're interfering with, she replied, her voice low and intense. The SyncTech deal is just the beginning. The intellectual property portfolio we've developed. The portfolio developed using company resources while systematically hiding profits, I corrected her. Assets that legally should have been declared as part of the marital estate. Before she could respond, Mason appeared at her side, placing a possessive hand on her arm. Don't engage, Amber. Our attorneys will handle this. The irony wasn't lost. On me, the same dismissive tone he had used when explaining complex business matters to me was now being directed at his new partner. You should listen to your own advice, Mason, I suggested, because right now, your attorneys are fighting a losing battle against documented evidence of financial misconduct. Each move you make only strengthens our case. As they walked away, I noticed something I hadn't expected: tension between them. The united front they had initially presented was showing cracks, Mason's frustrated body language and Amber's tight expression suggesting disagreement about their strategy. Rachel confirmed my observation later that afternoon. We've been monitoring their communications, legally through the court-ordered discovery process, she clarified. There's definitely conflict brewing. Amber appears to be pushing for a more aggressive approach to protecting the Cayman assets, while Mason is beginning to consider a legitimate settlement. What's causing the shift? I asked. SyncTech is getting nervous, she explained. Their legal team has expressed concerns about the financial discrepancies we've uncovered. They've requested a meeting with both Mason and their board to discuss potential impact on the acquisition timeline and valuation. The leverage was shifting in our favor with each passing hour. Mason had spent years building his exit strategy, carefully hiding assets while I worked to pay off his debt. Now that elaborate plan was unraveling, thread by thread, exposing the financial deception at its core. Later that evening, as I sat in my home office reviewing the latest documents from our forensic team, my phone rang with an unknown number. Parker? A man's voice inquired when I answered. This is Victor Ramirez, General Counsel for SyncTech Industries. I wonder if we might have a conversation about rapid build technologies and your current legal proceedings with Mason Parker. The call I'd been waiting for had finally come. The potential acquirer was reaching out directly, bypassing Mason and his team entirely. The chess game had entered a new phase, with an unexpected player joining the board, one whose financial resources dwarfed anything Mason could bring to bear. I'd be happy to discuss the situation, I replied, keeping my tone professionally neutral while my mind raced with strategic possibilities. When would be convenient for you? As I scheduled the meeting for the following morning, I realized that Mason's supposedly empty bank account was about to yield an even bigger surprise than I had initially anticipated. The company he had built using my financial support, the company he had planned to sell without sharing the proceeds, might now become the instrument of a much more comprehensive justice than I had originally envisioned. The SyncTech headquarters occupied the top 5 floors of a gleaming glass tower downtown. As I stepped out of the elevator into their reception area, I was immediately struck by the contrast with Rapid Build's more modest offices, where Mason's company projected the scrappy energy of a tech startup. SyncTech exuded established corporate power, museum-quality artwork on the walls, custom furniture in the waiting area, and staff dressed in perfect business attire. Catherine had insisted on accompanying me to this meeting, along with Rachel, whose financial expertise would be invaluable. We were escorted to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. Victor Ramirez, SyncTech's general counsel, greeted us with professional warmth. In his mid-50s with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he projected the calm confidence of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. Mrs. Parker, thank you for coming on such short notice, he said, gesturing toward the conference table where 3 other executives waited. Allow me to introduce Diane Chen, our CEO, Marcus Fletcher, Chief Financial Officer, and Bryce Wilson, head of our Acquisitions and Mergers Division. Diane Chen, an elegant woman in her early 60s, nodded in acknowledgement. We appreciate your willingness to meet with us directly. The situation with Rapid Build has become complicated for our acquisition team. Complicated is one way to put it, Bryce Wilson added, his British accent crisp. Finding significant undisclosed offshore holdings during due diligence tends to raise red flags for our shareholders. I exchanged glances with Catherine, who gave a subtle nod of encouragement. We had anticipated SyncTech's concerns, but the direct confirmation was valuable. I understand your position, I replied carefully. The offshore holdings came as a surprise to me as well, despite my role in supporting Rapid Build's development. Over the past 7 years, Marcus Fletcher, the CFO, leaned forward. That's precisely why we wanted this meeting, Mrs. Parker. Our due diligence team has been reviewing the court filings in your divorce proceedings. The financial documentation you've provided regarding your contributions to Rapid Build's growth presents a materially different picture than what Mr. Parker shared during our initial acquisition discussions. Diane Chen tapped a folder in front of her. According to our records, Mr. Parker represented himself as the sole founding investor of Rapid Build Technologies, with Ms. Reeves joining as a minority partner 3 years ago. There was no mention of your financial support during the company's formative years, nor of any marital assets being used to fund operations. That omission was deliberate, Catherine interjected. As our court filings demonstrate, there has been a systematic effort to minimize Mrs. Parker's contributions and to shield company assets from proper division during divorce proceedings. Victor Ramirez nodded, unsurprised, which creates significant liability concerns for any potential acquirer. Undisclosed ownership claims and financial improprieties can void acquisition agreements or lead to shareholder lawsuits. Let me be direct, Diane Chen said, her gaze steady. The technology Rapid Build has developed is valuable to SyncTech's long-term strategy, but we cannot proceed with an acquisition while these ownership issues remain unresolved, and we certainly won't be party to any attempt to deprive a legitimate stakeholder of their rightful interest. The statement was carefully worded but clear in its implications. SyncTech wasn't walking away from the acquisition entirely, but they wouldn't proceed while my claims remained unaddressed. We understand your position, Catherine responded. My client has been seeking an equitable resolution from the beginning, one that properly acknowledges her contributions to Rapid Build's success. Bryce Wilson leaned forward. Perhaps you could outline what you consider an equitable resolution, Mrs. Parker? From SyncTech's perspective, clarity on all stakeholder expectations would be extremely valuable at this juncture. It was the opening I'd been waiting for. With a nod from Catherine, I laid out my position. My goal has always been simple: fair compensation for the years I spent supporting Rapid Build's development, while simultaneously working to pay off my husband's substantial student debt. Based on the financial records we've uncovered, I believe I'm entitled to 40% of Rapid Build's true value, including the assets currently held through Cayman Holdings. Marcus Fletcher wrote something in his notebook. And this 40% figure, how did you arrive at that specific valuation of your contribution? Rachel opened her laptop, displaying a spreadsheet we had prepared. We've documented Mrs. Parker's direct financial contributions through analysis of their joint accounts over a 7-year period. During Rapid Build's first 4 years, Mrs. Parker's income covered approximately 70% of their household expenses, allowing Mr. Parker to reinvest his early business income back into the company, rather than servicing his student debt or contributing proportionally to their living expenses. She scrolled to another section of the analysis. Additionally, Mrs. Parker contributed $47,800 in direct loans to the company during cash flow shortages in its second year. Loans that were never formally repaid despite being documented in the company's early financial records. Diane Chen and her team listened intently as Rachel continued outlining the financial evidence, supporting my claim to a significant portion of Rapid Build's value. When she finished, the room fell silent for a moment as the SyncTech executives exchanged glances. This is comprehensive, Victor Ramirez finally said, and largely consistent with what our financial team uncovered during extended due diligence. The offshore structure was cleverly designed, but the money trail is clear once you know what to look for. "What's your current relationship with Mr. Parker?" Diane Chen asked, her question catching me slightly off guard. "We haven't spoken directly since the court hearing 3 days ago," I replied. "All communication has been through our attorneys." She nodded thoughtfully. "And would you be opposed to a mediated resolution that preserved the acquisition opportunity? One that fairly compensated you while allowing the transaction to move forward?" Catherine and I had discussed this possibility beforehand. If SyncTech wanted the acquisition badly enough, they might be willing to facilitate a settlement that acknowledged my claims without requiring a protracted court battle. "I'm open to mediation," I confirmed. "My goal has never been to block the acquisition or damage the company. I simply want recognition of my contributions and fair compensation." Diane exchanged glances with her team before continuing. "In that case, we'd like to propose a structure that might satisfy all parties. Rather than acquiring Rapid Build with these unresolved ownership claims, SyncTech could instead make separate agreements with each legitimate stakeholder." Bryce Wilson elaborated. "In essence, we would make independent offers to purchase your interest in Rapid Build, Mr. Parker's interest, and Ms. Reeves's interest, each valued according to proper financial analysis rather than the artificially constructed ownership percentages they've been operating under." It was a clever approach, bypassing the disputed internal ownership structure of Rapid Build entirely by making direct offers to each stakeholder based on SyncTech's independent valuation of their legitimate claims. "That's an interesting proposition," Catherine noted carefully. "Though it would require full transparency regarding the total acquisition value and how individual stakeholder interests are calculated." "Absolutely," Marcus Fletcher agreed. "Complete transparency would be essential. We have nothing to gain from perpetuating the financial shell game Mr. Parker has been playing." As the meeting continued, we discussed the specifics of how such an arrangement might work. SyncTech would engage an independent valuation firm to assess each stakeholder's legitimate claim to Rapid Build's assets, including the intellectual property and client contracts currently held by Cayman Holdings. Based on that assessment, they would make separate purchase offers that collectively added up to the total acquisition price. "There's one additional element to consider," Victor Ramirez added as the discussion wound down. "Our investigation suggests that several key technical innovations credited to Mr. Parker actually originated in your joint household during the company's early years. Do you have any documentation regarding intellectual contribution to the company's core products?" The question triggered a memory I'd almost forgotten. During Rapid Build's first 2 years, when Mason was working from our home office, we'd often discussed his technical challenges over dinner. My background in financial systems had occasionally provided insights that helped solve particular problems, insights Mason had incorporated into the company's products. I was never formally credited on any patents, I acknowledged. But I may have emails and notes from that period that document some conceptual contributions, particularly to the financial modeling components of their enterprise resource planning module. Bryce Wilson looked particularly interested. That module is actually one of the most valuable components of their technology stack from our perspective. Any documentation you could provide would be extremely relevant to our valuation process. As the meeting concluded, Diane Chen walked us to the elevator. "We'll have our team prepare a formal mediation proposal by tomorrow," she said. "And Mrs. Parker, regardless of how this situation resolves, I want you to know that SyncTech values the kind of financial acumen and persistence you've demonstrated. If you're ever interested in exploring opportunities with us, my door is open." The unexpected job offer, for that was clearly what it was, caught me by surprise. For so long, my professional identity had been subordinated to supporting Mason's ambitions. The idea that my skills might be valued by a company of SyncTech's caliber was both flattering and empowering. In the elevator, Catherine couldn't contain a smile. "That went even better than we anticipated. They're practically offering to be your advocate against Mason." They're offering to protect their acquisition, Rachel corrected, ever practical. But the effect is the same. Mason no longer controls the narrative about Rapid Build's ownership or value. Back at Catherine's office, we briefed Tom Wilson, who had been monitoring the financial aspects of the case since I first discovered the Black Ledger. SyncTech's approach is actually quite elegant, he observed after hearing our report. By making separate offers to each legitimate stakeholder, they avoid getting entangled in your internal ownership dispute while still securing the technology they want. How do you think Mason will respond? I asked. Tom considered this. He's in a difficult position. If he refuses to participate in the mediation, SyncTech will likely walk away entirely, destroying the very acquisition opportunity he's been positioning for. But accepting mediation means acknowledging your claim to a significant portion of Rapid Build's value. He'll try to minimize my percentage, I predicted. Argue that my contributions were minimal compared to his visionary leadership or some such nonsense. Let him try, Catherine said confidently. The financial evidence supporting your claim is robust. And now we have SyncTech's independent assessment team looking at the same data. Mason can't charm or manipulate his way around objective financial analysis. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Diane Chen from SyncTech. Would you be available for a private conversation tomorrow morning? There are some aspects of the situation I'd like to discuss directly. I showed the message to Catherine, who looked intrigued. That's unexpected. SyncTech's CEO wanting a one-on-one conversation outside the formal mediation process. Should I accept? Absolutely, she advised. But keep it professional and don't make any commitments without consulting me first. I replied to Diane, agreeing to meet her for breakfast at a downtown hotel restaurant the following morning. That evening, as I returned to the empty house that still contained so many memories of my life with Mason, I found a small package on the doorstep, a courier delivery requiring signature. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. Insurance policy. Use if necessary. AA for Amber. The handwriting matched notes I'd seen at Rapid Build's office. I called Rachel immediately, describing the package and its cryptic contents. Don't connect that drive to any of your personal devices, she warned. It could contain malware designed to corrupt your evidence or spy on your communications. Bring it to my office tomorrow morning. I have a secure sandbox environment where we can examine the content safely. The mysterious delivery left me unsettled. Was this a genuine attempt by Amber to provide helpful information, or some kind of trap designed to compromise our legal position? The dynamic between Mason and Amber had clearly shifted since our courthouse encounter, but I couldn't be certain where her loyalties now lay. Sleep eluded me that night as I mentally prepared for my private meeting with SyncTech's CEO while wondering about the contents of Amber's USB drive. The stakes in this elaborate chess game were escalating daily, with new players and unexpected moves constantly changing the strategic landscape. Morning brought a text from Mason, the first direct communication since our tense phone call days. Earlier. Heard about your SyncTech meeting. We need to talk before this goes any further. I didn't respond. Let him wonder about my conversation with Diane Chen, about what SyncTech might have offered, about how much I knew regarding Rapid Build's true value. The uncertainty would only increase pressure on him to consider a fair settlement. Diane Chen was already seated when I arrived at the hotel restaurant, dressed impeccably in a gray suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. She rose to greet me with a firm handshake. "Thank you for meeting privately," she said as we settled at a secluded table overlooking the city. "Some conversations are best had without attorneys present, though I understand you'll want to consult yours before making any decisions." "Of course," I replied cautiously. "May I ask why you wanted this private meeting?" Diane sipped her coffee before answering. "I've been watching how you've handled this situation with Mason Parker, methodically gathering evidence, strategically leveraging your professional skills. maintaining composure under extreme personal stress. It's impressive. Thank you, I said, surprised by the personal assessment. It's not merely a compliment, she continued. It's a professional observation. SyncTech is acquiring Rapid Build primarily for its technology, but we're also evaluating its human assets, the people whose talent and vision created that technology. She paused, studying me over her coffee cup. Our due diligence has revealed something interesting. Despite being credited solely to Mason Parker, several key algorithmic innovations in Rapid Build's core products show evidence of a different mind at work, particularly in the financial modeling components. I felt a rush of validation, hearing my uncredited contributions acknowledged by someone who understood their value. Mason and I did discuss technical challenges frequently during the company's early years, I acknowledged. My background in financial systems often provided perspective on how certain functions should work from an end-user standpoint. Diane nodded, which explains the elegant user-centric design of those components, a design philosophy that doesn't appear in the products Mason developed before your marriage. She placed a folder on the table between us. This is a preliminary analysis from our technical team comparing Rapid Build's early prototypes with their current enterprise products. The evolution shows two distinct design approaches merging over time, one heavily technical, the other more intuitive and user-focused. I opened the folder, scanning the detailed comparison that validated what I had always known but never been credited for. My contributions to Rapid Build's products went beyond financial support and extended to actual design concepts that made the software more intuitive for financial professionals. Why are you showing me this? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect her intention. Because SyncTech values innovation regardless of where it originates, she replied directly, and because I'm about to make you an offer that has nothing to do with your divorce settlement. She slid another document across the table, this one bearing SyncTech's corporate letterhead. This is a formal offer of employment as Director of Financial Product Development within our Enterprise Solutions division. The position would involve overseeing the integration of Rapid Build's technology into SyncTech's broader product ecosystem, with particular focus on enhancing the financial components that bear your unacknowledged influence. I stared at the document, momentarily speechless. The compensation package outlined was substantial, far more than I currently earned as a senior financial analyst at Wilson & Bradley. This is separate from any settlement regarding your ownership. Stake in Rapid Build, Diane clarified. We believe your talents are underutilized in your current role, and we see significant potential for you to lead product development in an area where you've already demonstrated considerable aptitude. Does Mason know about this offer? I asked. Diane's smile was subtle but telling. No, and I don't intend to inform him until after our acquisition is complete. What he failed to recognize, your value as an innovator rather than merely a financial supporter, SyncTech sees clearly. As I left the breakfast meeting with Diane's offer in my bag, my phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. USB examined. Contains internal emails between Mason and SyncTech dating back 18 months. Evidence suggests acquisition discussions began much earlier than disclosed, with a deliberate timeline to complete the deal after divorce. Come to the office ASAP. The pieces were falling into place with stunning clarity. Mason hadn't just hidden assets. He had orchestrated an elaborate deception designed to ensure I would receive nothing from the SyncTech acquisition he had been planning for over a year. His exit strategy had been even more calculated than I'd initially suspected. But his careful plans were unraveling thread by thread, exposing not just financial misconduct, but a deliberate attempt to steal credit for innovations I had contributed. And now, ironically, the very company he had courted as an acquirer was offering me a position that recognized what he had always denied: my legitimate role in building the technology that made Rapid Build valuable. As I headed toward Rachel's office to review Amber's insurance policy, I felt a strange sense of gratitude toward Mason. His betrayal had forced me to reclaim not just my financial worth, but my professional identity as well. The supposedly empty bank account he'd left behind was yielding surprises beyond anything either of us could have anticipated. Surprises that would reshape not just our divorce settlement, but the entire future I had once put on hold to support. His dreams. Rachel's office was a hive of activity when I arrived. 3 computer screens displayed different data sets as she and a cybersecurity specialist pored over the contents of Amber's USB drive. "This is explosive," Rachel said as I entered, gesturing to the central monitor. "Amber didn't just send evidence, she sent us the complete internal communication history between Mason and SyncTech going back 18 months. The cybersecurity specialist, a young woman with vibrant blue hair and multiple monitors, nodded, in agreement. The files are authenticated with digital signatures and metadata that would make them admissible in court. Someone wanted to make absolutely sure this evidence couldn't be dismissed as fabricated. I leaned over to examine the screen, which displayed an email exchange between Mason and Bryce Wilson from SyncTech, dated 15 months earlier, well before Mason claimed the acquisition talks had begun, from Mason Parker to Bryce Wilson. Subject: Acquisition timeline. Bryce. The timeline works perfectly. My personal situation should be resolved by Q3 of next year, clearing the way for a clean acquisition without unnecessary complications. The offshore restructuring is proceeding as planned, with all high-value IP assets transferred to Cayman, holdings by end of month. As discussed, official acquisition talks should not begin until after my divorce is finalized. My wife has no knowledge of these discussions or the true value of Rapid Build's IP portfolio. Looking forward to our off-the-record meeting in Phoenix next month. Best, Mason. The casual cruelty of the message, reducing our marriage to a personal situation that needed to be resolved before his business plans could proceed, sent a chill through me. There are dozens of these exchanges, Rachel explained, scrolling through the email archive. Mason has been positioning for this acquisition for over a year, deliberately timing it to occur after your divorce was finalized, so you wouldn't be entitled to any portion of the proceeds. Why would Amber give us this? I wondered aloud. She's implicated in many of these emails. The cybersecurity specialist, who introduced herself as Mia, pointed to another screen displaying a different email thread. Based on the most recent exchanges, there appears to be significant conflict between Mason and Amber. 3 days ago, Mason proposed restructuring Cayman Holdings to reduce Amber's ownership percentage from 30% to 15%, claiming her contribution had been overvalued in the initial agreement. So that explained Amber's sudden willingness to provide evidence against Mason. He had turned on her just as he had turned on me, attempting to minimize her stake once the acquisition payday was in sight. "There's more," Rachel said, switching screens to display financial projections labeled Post-Acquisition Value Analysis. These documents show the true anticipated value of the SyncTech acquisition, including post-merger integration projections. The total compensation package isn't the $20 million we initially discovered. It's closer to $35 million when you include the equity options and performance incentives. $35 million. The figure was staggering. Mason had been preparing to walk away with tens of millions while leaving me with our modest house and depleted savings accounts. "This changes everything," I said, my mind racing with implications. "Catherine needs to see this immediately. Already sent her a secure link to the full archive," Rachel confirmed. "She's reviewing it with her team now and preparing additional motions for tomorrow's court hearing." My phone buzzed with a text from Mason. "Heard you had breakfast with Diane Chen. Whatever she offered you, we should discuss before you make any decisions." So he had spies at SyncTech, or more likely, someone had seen us together at the hotel restaurant and reported back. Either way, Mason was clearly concerned about my direct communication with SyncTech's CEO. I showed the message to Rachel, who smiled thinly. "He's getting nervous. Good. Let him wonder what you know and what SyncTech might have offered you." Before I could respond to Mason, another text arrived. This one from Amber. Mason knows about the USB. Be careful. He's desperate. The warning sent a wave of unease through me. Mason had always been calculating, but I'd never considered him dangerous. Now, with millions of dollars and his professional reputation at stake, I wasn't sure what he might be capable of. We should take additional security precautions, Rachel suggested, reading Amber's message over my shoulder. If Mason is truly desperate, he might take extreme measures to protect himself. Catherine arrived at Rachel's office an hour later, her expression a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal concern. The evidence Amber provided is exactly what we needed, she confirmed, setting her briefcase on Rachel's desk. It establishes a clear pattern of deliberate financial concealment specifically designed to deprive you of marital assets. The judge is going to have a field day with this. What about Amber? I asked. She's implicated in many of these communications. She's made a calculated decision, Catherine explained. By providing this evidence voluntarily, she's positioning herself as a cooperative witness rather than a co-conspirator. Smart move on her part. And dangerous, Rachel added. Mason won't take this betrayal lightly. Catherine nodded in agreement. Which is why I've arranged for private security to monitor your home and accompany you until this situation is resolved. The firm we work with is discreet but extremely effective. Under normal circumstances, I might have protested such a precaution as excessive. But Mason's increasingly desperate behavior and Amber's explicit warning suggested prudence was warranted. There's something else you should see, I said, showing Catherine the job offer from SyncTech. Diane Chen made this offer during our breakfast meeting. It's completely separate from any settlement regarding my stake in Rapid Build. Catherine reviewed the document, her eyebrows rising at the compensation package. This is unusual during ongoing litigation. SyncTech must be very impressed with your capabilities. They've identified my unacknowledged contributions to Rapid Build's core technology, I explained, particularly in the financial modeling components that make their software valuable to enterprise clients. This actually strengthens our position considerably, Catherine noted. An independent technical assessment validating your intellectual contribution to Rapid Build's products adds another dimension to your claim beyond just financial support. As we strategize for the next day's court hearing, my phone rang with a call from an unknown number. Catherine gestured for me to put it on speaker. Eleanor Parker? A woman's voice inquired when I answered. Yes, speaking. This is Josephine Mercer, Mr. Mason Parker's attorney. I'm calling to discuss the possibility of reaching a settlement prior to tomorrow's court hearing. Catherine leaned forward, intrigued by this sudden willingness to negotiate, after days of stonewalling. I'm with my attorney now, I replied. You're on speaker. Ms. Winters, good afternoon, Josephine acknowledged smoothly. My client has authorized me to present a revised settlement offer that he believes addresses the core concerns raised in your filings. We're listening, Catherine replied, her tone professionally neutral. Mr. Parker is prepared to offer a lump sum payment of $5 million, plus continued ownership of the marital home and all personal property currently in Mrs. Parker's possession. In exchange, Mrs. Parker would relinquish any claim to Rapid Build Technologies or its affiliated entities, including Cayman Holdings. $5 million, a significant increase from the original $1 million offer, but still far less than my legitimate stake in Rapid Build's true value. That's an interesting starting point, Catherine replied, emphasizing the word starting. However, given the evidence we've recently obtained regarding Rapid Build's pending acquisition by SyncTech Industries and the true value of assets held, through Cayman Holdings, we believe a fair settlement would be substantially higher. A pause on the other end of the line. What evidence are you referring to? Catherine smiled at the hesitation in Josephine's voice. Evidence we'll be presenting in court tomorrow, unless we reach an appropriate settlement beforehand. Documentation that establishes both the true value of the company, approximately $35 million, including all incentives and equity options, and the deliberate efforts to conceal that value until after divorce proceedings were complete. Another, longer pause. "I'll need to consult with my client and call you back." "Of course," Catherine replied smoothly. "We'll be here for the next hour. After that, we'll be focused on final preparations for tomorrow's hearing." As the call ended, Catherine's expression turned thoughtful. "$5 million is just a starting offer. They'll go higher once they realize how much we know." "How much higher?" I asked. "Based on the evidence and the circumstances, you're legitimately entitled to at least 40% of Rapid Build's total value, which puts your settlement in the $14 million range, possibly higher given your unacknowledged intellectual contributions." The figure was dizzying. Even after 7 years of financial sacrifice, I had never imagined such a sum as part of my future. The irony wasn't lost on me. Mason's betrayal, intended to deprive me of the company's value, had ultimately forced me to discover and claim my full worth. An hour later, Josephine Mercer called back as promised. "After consulting with my client," she began, her tone carefully modulated, "we're prepared to offer $8 million as a complete settlement, contingent on immediate resolution and full confidentiality." Catherine didn't hesitate. "Our counteroffer is $15 million, reflecting Mrs. Parker's legitimate contribution to Rapid Build's development and current value. This amount is non-negotiable given the evidence we intend to present tomorrow." $15 million is completely unreasonable," Josephine protested. "Mr. Parker built that company from nothing." "With Mrs. Parker's financial support, intellectual contribution, and at the cost of her own career advancement," Catherine interrupted firmly. "And let's not forget the deliberate effort to hide assets offshore and time the SyncTech acquisition to occur after divorce proceedings. A strategy we can now document through 18 months of internal communications." The silence that followed suggested Josephine was taken aback by the specific reference to communications she might not have known we possessed. "I'll need to consult with my client again," she finally replied. "We'll expect your response within the hour," Catherine said. "After that, we'll proceed with our court preparations." As we waited for Josephine's return call, Catherine outlined the various scenarios we might face the following day. "If they accept our terms, we'll have a settlement agreement drafted and ready for signing before the hearing. If they refuse, we'll present our evidence to the judge, who will likely expand the asset freeze to include all entities connected to Rapid Build and possibly appoint a special master to oversee valuation of the company pending final judgment." My phone buzzed with a text from Diane Chen. "Heard negotiations are underway. Whatever the outcome, our offer stands independently. Your talents deserve recognition regardless of your settlement." The message reinforced what was becoming increasingly clear. This wasn't just about financial compensation anymore. It was about reclaiming my professional identity and the recognition I had been denied during my marriage to Mason. 57. Minutes after her previous call, Josephine Mercer called back. "My client has authorized me to accept your settlement figure of $15 million with certain conditions," she began, her tone suggesting Mason had not made this concession willingly. "Payment would be structured over 3 years, with an initial lump sum of $5 million followed by annual payments of $5 million each. The agreement would include strict confidentiality provisions and mutual non-disparagement clauses." Catherine met my gaze, raising an eyebrow in silent question. I nodded. "We accept the payment structure," she replied. "However, we'll need verification that the full amount is secured against Rapid Build's assets or placed in escrow to ensure compliance with the payment schedule. And while we agree to reasonable confidentiality regarding the specific settlement amount, Mrs. Parker maintains the right to discuss her contributions to Rapid Build's technology and development." After some additional negotiation over specific terms, we reached a final agreement: $15 million over 3 years, secured by a lien against Rapid Build's domestic assets and Mason's personal stake in the SyncTech acquisition. The Confidentiality provision would cover financial details, but explicitly excluded any restriction on discussing my role in developing the company's core technology. As Catherine ended the call to begin drafting the settlement documents, Rachel gave me a congratulatory squeeze. "You did it, Ellie. $15 million and the freedom to reclaim credit for your contributions. Plus, a potential career opportunity with SyncTech," I added, still processing the rapid developments of the past few hours. "Mason must be livid," Rachel observed. "He tried to walk away with everything, and instead, he's forced to acknowledge your value, financially and professionally." That evening, as I returned home with my newly assigned security detail discreetly monitoring the property, I received a text from Mason. "I hope you're satisfied. You've destroyed everything I built." The message revealed so much about Mason's perspective. Even now, after all the evidence we'd uncovered, he still viewed Rapid Build as solely his creation, still refusing to acknowledge the partnership that had made it possible. I considered ignoring the message, but something compelled me to respond one final time. "I didn't destroy anything, Mason. I simply claimed the value of my contribution. The same value you sought to deny me when you walked out the day after I paid off your student loans. The company will continue. SyncTech will complete their acquisition. The only thing that's changed is that you can no longer take sole credit for success that was built on shared sacrifice." His response came minutes later. "SyncTech offered you a job, didn't they? This was about more than money for you." "It was always about more than money," I replied. "It was about recognition, partnership, respect. All the things you promised when we built our life together, and all the things you discarded when you decided I was no longer useful to your ambitions." When no further messages came, I set my phone aside and walked through the house that had once represented our shared future. Tomorrow, I will sign the settlement agreement. The day after, I would meet with Diane Chen to discuss the position at SyncTech. Life was moving forward in ways I couldn't have imagined just weeks ago when Mason walked out with his suitcase. The following morning, I arrived at the courthouse with Catherine and Rachel to find Mason and his legal team already waiting in the hallway outside the courtroom. Mason looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes and his typically immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. Beside him, Josephine Mercer was reviewing the settlement documents one final time. Amber was conspicuously absent, likely distancing herself from Mason now that her insurance policy had served its purpose. I wondered briefly what settlement she had negotiated for her stake in Cayman Holdings, or whether that battle was still to come. As we approached, Mason's gaze met mine for the first time since he had walked out of our home. The confident, controlling man who had dismissed my contributions and planned his exit with such calculated precision was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the consequences of his actions. "The documents are in order," Josephine announced, handing the final copies to Catherine for our review. "Once signed and filed with the court, the settlement will be legally binding." Catherine and I reviewed each page carefully before I signed where indicated. Mason did the same, his signature noticeably less steady than the bold scrawl I remembered from countless anniversary cards and joint tax returns over the years. "The first payment will be transferred to the escrow account within 24 hours, Josephine confirmed as we completed the signing. "Subsequent payments will follow the schedule outlined in Section 4. With the documents signed and notarized, Catherine left to file them with the court clerk, while Mason and I found ourselves momentarily alone in the hallway, Josephine having stepped away to make a call. "Was any of it real?" I asked, the question escaping before I could consider whether I truly wanted to know the answer. "Us, I mean. Or was I always just a means to an end for you?" Mason looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "It was real in the beginning," he finally said, his voice low. "But somewhere along the way, the company became everything. Success, growth, acquisition. They became the only metrics that mattered. And people became assets to be leveraged, or liabilities to be managed," I concluded for him. He didn't deny it. "SyncTech will be good for you," he said instead. Diane Chen builds genuine teams, not just efficient organizational structures. It's why they've succeeded where so many other tech companies have failed. It was as close to an acknowledgement of my capabilities as I had ever heard from him, delivered only after those capabilities had been validated by someone whose opinion he respected. "Goodbye, Mason," I said simply, turning away as Catherine returned with confirmation that our settlement had been officially filed and accepted by the court. As we left the courthouse, Rachel received a notification on her phone. "SyncTech just issued a press release announcing their acquisition of Rapid Build Technologies," she reported, scanning the text. They specifically mention the innovative financial modeling components developed with input from Eleanor Parker as a key element of Rapid Build's value proposition. The public acknowledgement of my contribution, something Mason had never offered in 7 years of marriage, felt like the final piece falling into place. The supposedly empty bank account Mason had left behind had indeed held surprising secrets, not just millions in hidden assets, but the proof of my unrecognized value, both financial and intellectual. As I stepped into the bright spring morning, $15 million richer and with a promising career opportunity ahead, I realized Mason's betrayal had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible: the chance to reclaim not just my financial worth, but my entire identity. The debt had finally been paid in full, not just his student loans, but the years of unacknowledged contribution that had made his success possible. Sometimes, the most valuable discoveries come from the accounts we never thought to examine, the hidden worth within ourselves that others fail to recognize until we demand the full accounting we deserve. 3 months after my board nomination, I found myself addressing SyncTech's annual shareholder meeting in the grand ballroom of the Westfield Conference Center. 500 investors, executives, and industry analysts watched as I outlined the strategic vision for our enhanced financial product ecosystem. "Integration remains the cornerstone of our approach," I explained, gesturing toward the dynamic visualization behind me. "By seamlessly connecting financial modeling with predictive analytics, we've created a platform that adapts to emerging market conditions rather than merely responding to them." From my position at the podium, I could see Diane Chen in the front row, nodding approvingly. Beside her sat the SyncTech board members who had unanimously approved my nomination, a validation of both my technical expertise and leadership philosophy. As I concluded the presentation, applause rippled through the ballroom. Questions from major investors followed, each addressing me with the respect typically reserved for long-established industry leaders, rather than someone who had joined the corporate leadership ranks just a year earlier. "Ms. Parker, your integration of Rapid Build's technology with SyncTech's existing framework has created remarkable shareholder value," noted a representative from Meridian Capital, one of our largest institutional investors. "How do you envision extending this approach to the international markets we're targeting next quarter?" The question allowed me to showcase the global expansion strategy I'd been developing, a plan that would extend our financial products into emerging markets while adapting to regional regulatory frameworks and cultural approaches to financial management. Afterward, during the executive reception, Victor Ramirez approached with a tall, distinguished man I immediately recognized as Alexander Bennett, CEO of Bennett Financial Group, one of the largest investment firms on the East Coast. "Eleanor Parker," Victor said warmly. "Allow me to introduce Alexander Bennett. He's expressed particular interest in your financial modeling architecture and its applications for institutional investors." "Ms. Parker," Bennett said, shaking my hand firmly. "Your presentation was extraordinarily impressive. Several of our lead analysts have been implementing your adaptive modeling framework with remarkable results." "I'm pleased to hear that," I replied. "We designed the system specifically for sophisticated users who understand the limitations of traditional static models, which is precisely why I wanted to meet you," Bennett continued. "Our firm is establishing an innovation advisory board, elite practitioners who can help guide our technological evolution. Your perspective would be invaluable, particularly given your unique background spanning both traditional financial analysis and cutting-edge technology development. The invitation to join Bennett Financial Group's Innovation Advisory Board, a prestigious appointment that would connect me with some of the industry's most forward-thinking leaders, underscored how dramatically my professional standing had evolved. From working endless hours to pay off Mason's debt while my own career stagnated, I had emerged as a sought-after voice in financial technology innovation. I'd be interested in learning more, I told Bennett, exchanging business cards before Diane signaled that it was time for the board's formal introduction to key shareholders. Later that evening, as the reception wound down, I stepped onto the conference center's terrace for a moment of quiet reflection. The city skyline sparkled against the night sky, a fitting backdrop for contemplating the journey of the past 15 months. "Quite the view, isn't it?" came a familiar voice behind me. I turned to find Tom Wilson, my mentor from Wilson & Bradley, who had been the first to help me unravel Mason's financial deception. "Tom, I didn't know you were attending the shareholder meeting." He smiled, joining me at the terrace railing. "Wilson & Bradley has a modest investment position in SyncTech. Not enough to influence policy, but enough to warrant an invitation. I must say, it was gratifying watching you command that room today." "I had excellent mentors," I acknowledged, grateful for his early guidance during the most challenging period of my life. "Perhaps," Tom conceded, "but you had the resilience and vision to transform adversity into opportunity. Not everyone would have emerged from that situation stronger." We stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the city lights. "Have you heard the latest about Mason?" Tom finally asked. "Only that his new venture is struggling. Rachel mentioned something about funding challenges." Tom nodded. "That's putting it mildly. His attempt to launch a competing platform has hit multiple roadblocks. Without the rapid build intellectual property, which now belongs to SyncTech, he's essentially starting from scratch with limited innovative differentiation." I felt no satisfaction at this news, only a sense of appropriate consequence. Mason had attempted to build his success on others' contributions, mine and eventually Amber's, while denying proper recognition. The approach had ultimately proven unsustainable. "And Amber?" I inquired, curious about the woman who had provided the insurance policy that had strengthened my negotiating position. "Launched her own consulting firm specializing in user experience design," Tom replied. "Seems she learned valuable lessons from her association with Mason, both what to do and what not to do in business relationships." The following week brought the official announcement of the Eleanor Parker Foundation's inaugural grant recipients. We held the ceremony at the Women in Financial Technology Summit, with over 200 industry professionals in attendance. One by one, the 25 women selected for our comprehensive support program took the stage to briefly describe their innovations and career aspirations. Melissa Donovan, a brilliant algorithm developer whose credit scoring model had been incorporated into her employer's lending platform without proper attribution, spoke directly to the heart of the Foundation's mission. "For years, I watched my ideas implemented while my name was systematically excluded from recognition," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "The Eleanor Parker Foundation hasn't just provided financial support. It's validated that my experience wasn't isolated or imaginary, but part of a pattern that needs addressing across our industry." As applause filled the ballroom, I caught sight of Jessica Morgan, the FinCorp CTO I had advised during acquisition discussions, sitting in the audience. Following our conversation, she had successfully negotiated proper recognition of her intellectual property contributions, resulting in a significantly improved equity position before SyncTech completed the acquisition. The foundation ceremony transitioned to a networking reception, where I found myself approached by a journalist from Financial Technology Review. "Ms. Parker, would you be willing to comment on the growing attribution movement that many are saying your foundation has catalyzed?" she asked, recording device ready. We're seeing similar initiatives emerging across the technology sector, all focused on ensuring proper credit and compensation for intellectual contributions. The question caught me by surprise. While I had established the foundation to address a problem I'd experienced personally, I hadn't anticipated sparking a broader industry movement. The issue of proper attribution isn't new, I replied thoughtfully. But perhaps what's changing is our willingness to acknowledge its importance and implement structural reforms. Innovation doesn't occur in isolation. It's inherently collaborative. Ensuring everyone's contributions are recognized isn't just fair to individuals. It creates more sustainable and innovative organizations. The journalist nodded approvingly. Your personal experience with Rapid Build has become something of a case study in business schools. Would you say that experience informs your current leadership approach at SyncTech? Absolutely, I confirmed. My leadership philosophy centers on creating environments where innovation is properly attributed and rewarded. When people know their contributions will be recognized, they invest more fully in collective success. The article published the following week highlighted the Parker Principle, ensuring that recognition and compensation align with actual contribution rather than hierarchical position or political influence within an organization. Diane Chen contacted me immediately after publication. You've articulated something we've been implementing intuitively, she said during our video call. The board is interested in formalizing this approach as part of our corporate governance principles. Would you be willing to lead a committee to develop specific guidelines? The request represented another step in my evolution from unacknowledged contributor to organizational change agent. By codifying proper attribution as a governance principle, we could potentially influence practices beyond SyncTech to the broader technology ecosystem. 2 days later, I received an unexpected email from Dr. Elaine Chen, no relation to Diane, Dean of Business Administration at Westbrook University, one of the country's premier academic institutions, Ms. Parker. Your recent feature in Financial Technology Review regarding the Parker Principle has generated significant discussion among our faculty, particularly those researching organizational innovation and equity practices. We would like to invite you to deliver a guest lecture series addressing the ETI intersection of intellectual property recognition, gender equity in technology, and sustainable innovation practices. Your unique perspective, spanning professional experience at both Wilson & Bradley and SyncTech, coupled with your personal journey establishing the Eleanor Parker Foundation, would provide invaluable insights for our graduate students. Additionally, our executive education program has expressed interest in developing a case study based on your experience, with your participation and guidance. Would you be available to discuss these opportunities further? The invitation to share my experience in an academic context presented yet another unexpected dimension to my journey. From being systematically denied credit for my contributions to potentially helping shape how future business leaders understand intellectual attribution. The transformation continued to unfold in ways I couldn't have anticipated when Mason walked out of our home 15 months earlier. I forwarded the email to Diane, who responded enthusiastically. Accept immediately. This kind of academic engagement enhances both your personal brand and SyncTech's reputation as an innovation leader. As spring turned to summer, my professional calendar filled with commitments that would have seemed impossible during my years with Mason. Keynote addresses at industry conferences, advisory board meetings for Bennett Financial Group, guest lectures at Westbrook University, and strategic planning sessions for the next phase of SyncTech's global expansion. Through it all, I maintained my focus on the Parker Chen Financial Suite, ensuring our flagship product remained at the cutting edge of enterprise financial technology. The development team had expanded to 45 engineers and designers, all operating under the attribution principle I had championed. Every innovation clearly credited to its originators regardless of their position in the organizational hierarchy. During a quarterly review meeting, our lead developer demonstrated a breakthrough in the system's predictive analytics module. The enhanced algorithm can now identify potential market shifts 12 to 18 hours before conventional indicators, she explained, displaying comparative performance metrics on the conference room screens. We've achieved this while maintaining 99.7% accuracy in controlled backtesting scenarios. Impressive, I acknowledged. Who developed the enhanced prediction model? Melissa Donovan, she replied, referring to one of our foundation grant recipients whom we had subsequently hired as a senior algorithm specialist. Her credit scoring methodology translated remarkably well to market pattern recognition. This was the attribution principle in action, recognizing innovative contributions regardless of seniority or position. Melissa had joined our team just 3 months earlier, yet her breakthrough was being properly acknowledged and celebrated. Later that afternoon, I received a notification that the final foundation selections for the second cohort had been completed. Reviewing the list of 35 women selected for comprehensive support, I was struck by their diverse backgrounds, from established financial institutions to scrappy startups, representing 12 countries and multiple approaches to financial technology innovation. What united them was a common experience, significant contributions that had gone unrecognized or undercompensated in their professional environments. The foundation wouldn't just provide financial support, it would connect these women with mentors who understood their challenges and opportunities for advancement that valued their unique capabilities. As I reviewed their profiles, my assistant notified me of an unexpected visitor. "Ms. Parker, there's Amber Reeves asking to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important." Amber. Mason's former partner, both professionally and personally. The woman whose insurance policy USB drive had provided crucial evidence during my divorce negotiations. "I'll see her," I decided after a moment's consideration. Amber entered my office with the confident stride I remembered from our confrontation at Rapid Build, though her expression carried none of the hostility from that encounter. She looked different, more self-possessed, less like someone playing a role in someone else's drama. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment," she began, taking the seat I offered. "I've been following the work of your foundation with great interest. I'm surprised you're tracking our activities," I admitted. Amber smiled slightly. "Perhaps I shouldn't be on your radar, given our history. But the work you're doing, ensuring women in financial technology receive proper recognition for their contributions, resonates with my experience." "With Mason, you mean?" She nodded, her expression turning reflective. "I made the same mistake you did, though for a shorter period. I allowed my contributions to be minimized in service of someone else's ambition. The USB drive I sent you was as much self-preservation as it was assisting your case." "It served both purposes effectively," I acknowledged. "May I ask why you're here today?" Amber straightened in her chair. "I've established Reeves Design Collaborative, specializing in user experience for financial applications. We're developing an accessibility framework for populations traditionally underserved by financial technology, elderly users, those with limited technological literacy, people with disabilities." Her explanation was delivered with genuine passion, rather than the calculated poise I remembered from our earlier encounters. "That sounds like meaningful work," I noted. "But it doesn't explain your unscheduled visit." "I'd like to apply for a corporate partnership with your foundation," she stated directly. "Not funding. We're well capitalized through venture investment, but mentorship and networking for my female developers who are creating innovative accessibility solutions." The request was unexpected but intriguing. Despite our complicated history, Amber's new venture aligned perfectly with the Foundation's mission of supporting women whose technological innovations improved financial accessibility. Our partnership program requires demonstrated commitment to proper attribution and equitable compensation practices, I explained. Given your previous involvement with Mason's creative accounting approaches, that would require thorough vetting. Amber didn't flinch at the reference. Which is why I brought our complete corporate governance documentation, equity distribution records, and attribution policies. She placed a flash drive on my desk. Fully transparent this time, unlike Cayman Holdings. Her directness was refreshing, acknowledging our history while proposing a forward-looking relationship based on shared values that had emerged from similar experiences. I'll have our foundation executive director review your materials, I promised. If everything aligns with our partnership requirements, we can certainly discuss next steps. As Amber stood to leave, she paused. For what it's worth, I learned valuable lessons from watching how you handled Mason's betrayal. You didn't just secure financial compensation, you reclaimed your professional identity and leveraged it into something meaningful. After she departed, I found myself reflecting on how our paths had converged and diverged. Both of us had been entangled with Mason's manipulative approach to business and personal relationships. Both had extricated ourselves and established independent professional identities. Now, potentially, both would be working toward greater equity in the financial technology ecosystem. That evening, as I prepared for a dinner meeting with Alexander Bennett to discuss the Innovation Advisory Board, my personal phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Eleanor Parker speaking, I answered. Ms. Parker, this is Gregory Sullivan from Thompson & Lloyd Publishing. I've been following your work with the Foundation and your leadership at SyncTech with great interest. Thank you, I replied cautiously, wondering what a publishing executive wanted. I'll be direct, Sullivan continued. We'd like to offer you a book deal. Your journey from unacknowledged contributor to industry leader represents exactly the kind of narrative our business leadership series aims to highlight. A book. My story shaped into guidance for others facing similar challenges. The idea was both intimidating and compelling. The working title we're proposing is Hidden Value: Reclaiming Your Worth in Business and Life, Sullivan explained. We envision a blend of personal narrative and actionable guidance for others, particularly women whose contributions are systematically undervalued. The opportunity to transform my experience into a resource for others aligned perfectly with the mission I had embraced through the Foundation and my leadership at SyncTech. From having my value hidden in Mason's shadow to potentially helping countless others recognize and reclaim their worth, the journey had come full circle. I'd like to learn more about your vision for the book, I told Sullivan, already mentally, outlining chapters that would guide readers through recognizing their value, documenting their contributions, and strategically reclaiming their professional worth. As I ended the call with a scheduled meeting to discuss the publishing opportunity, I gazed out at the city skyline from my office window. 15 months earlier, I had stood in an empty driveway clutching a loan payment confirmation and a goodbye note, feeling as though my world had collapsed. Now I moved through that same world as a recognized industry leader, board member, foundation founder, and potential author. Every aspect of this transformation had emerged from that moment of betrayal. From Mason's mistaken belief that my value expired once his debt was paid. The supposedly empty bank account he had left behind had indeed contained a surprise. Not just hidden financial assets, but the catalyst for discovering my true worth in a world that had consistently undervalued my contributions. In attempting to discard me, Mason had inadvertently set me on a path to greater success than our shared life had ever promised. As I gathered my materials for the Innovation Board dinner, my phone buzzed with a calendar notification. Greece. Travel planning. 6 p.m. tomorrow. The long-deferred dream of visiting Santorini, once pinned to our refrigerator as motivation during years of loan payments, was now scheduled for next month. Not as a reward for paying off someone else's debt, but as a celebration of my own achievements. Sometimes life's greatest treasures are discovered only after we stop searching for them in others' valuation of our worth and begin recognizing the value we've carried within ourselves all along. Looking for more? We've got two amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.